And we are now recording. Hello, audience. Welcome to the stream. Tonight we'll be continuing our little discussion that we started last weekend about the setting of Urtha, a project my friends and I have been working on for a few years now. Last time we covered the conception of the world, and its various epochs and fundamentals. But, looking back on the video I recorded, there's a pretty big issue with it, and that is the somewhat atrocious audio. Like, it is painfully quiet. So, I hope that I have rectified that this time around, and when it gets uploaded, and as it's being streamed now, I hope that it's better. I hope it's better. As time goes on, I'll continue tweaking audio settings and other little things in order to make this stream as pleasant as possible. But if you do want to hear what we covered last time around, the VOD has been uploaded to a little YouTube channel. I should have that linked somewhere, or it should go by the very name that I have for the Twitch channel. But as a recap for that, we covered the beginnings of the fictional world, we covered the rise and fall of various prior worlds and realms, and we also established the beginnings of humanity. This time around, we're going to be covering the first empire of man. And after that, I may cut the stream for a minute and maybe do some gameplay. Might as well mix things up and start trying out what other little streaming things could be fun. But for now, we cover the setting of Urtha, and importantly, the first empire of man. Now, after the flooding that had come to Urtha and the formation of its supercontinent, the Ire, the last of humanity was pressed to the eastern corner between the Draconic Mountains bordering the northern and the eastern region. There, humanity would cooperate and begin accruing various resources through agriculture and other such means of production in order to bolster their numbers and arm themselves, unifying under one general banner. The name of this empire has been lost to time, unfortunately, but after it had grown to a strong enough extent and the population had climbed to a high enough point, two factions would separate from them. These are the Knights of Wilhelm and the Nomads of Narlandun. The Knights of Wilhelm began traveling westward into a vast grove called the Living Forest, prior formed by the last Echidnic king. The Knights of Wilhelm are a lord named Xavier Wilhelm, and a collection of 12 generals who follow his lead, though the names of these first generals are no longer retained due to the massive period of time that had passed up to this day. His name and his bloodline have been preserved by his many copious followers. The 12 generals and Xavier Wilhelm would utilize pyromancy and woodcutting in order to begin felling the trees that blocked their way through the living jungle, and in doing so, used some of the resources and boons that this vast, dense flora could provide to set up villages and other things along the way. But in doing so, they alerted much of the wildlife to their presence, and also alerted the last remaining echidnas that they were present. That humanity was on the move again, and it was spreading its arms into other facets, looking for resources and land. So, in order to try and deter humanity from continuing to purge the echidnas, they would attempt a few creative little means of slowing their progress. And the first was through enforcement. Much as they had created the humans a long time ago, they attempted to create a counter to them. Using humanity as a template, they produced the elves. The elves were designed to be better in most respects, which included their intellect, beauty, and even granting them with superhuman capabilities in both the realm of physical strength and the realm of inherent magic. But in doing so, they also granted them another gift in great quantities that humanity possessed: hubris. The elves were extremely full of themselves by birthright, and a massive majority of them decided not even to assist the echidnas, simply moving to the central mountain of the Ire in order to set up home in this magical part of the world. A faction of them would remain, and these would be named the Wood Elves. They stuck close to the beliefs of the Echidnas and wanted to save them, and though they were very capable in combat against humanity, and were definitely a show of force, ultimately their low numbers would put them at a pretty hearty disadvantage. They were nearly pushed to extinction in that great wave, I suppose, and had to retreat to the rest of their siblings. The High Elves, who ruled over Elvenkind, welcomed the Wood Elves as a sort of lower class and sheltered them from humanity and the rest of their hostilities. This time period was called the Elven War, and it was rather meager. It was very short. But Xavier Wilhelm and his knights were barely deterred, and after cutting a great deal of the living jungle down through the eastern region of the Ire, they arrived to a geographical anomaly known as the Great River. The Great River was formed from a glacier that had manifested at the peak of the Ire's central mountain. This glacier is a collection of moisture and other frozen particles that accumulates during the evening from passing clouds and evaporation. But during the day, the glow of the illuminator causes the water to melt, producing an ever-flowing runoff that creates the Great River. It cuts through the border of the eastern and the western region, and even passes by the living jungle into the southern region. Using the Great River, Xavier and his men fastened dock towns and ships, then sailed to the other side in order to separate themselves from the Eastern Empire, which was beginning to grow along their trail as they left behind villages and other settlers. Hoping to resolve the issues with humanity they had, the Echidnas attempted to create another race. This race in particular were known as the Dwarves. They were rather stout individuals that continued to uphold the body plan of humanity, but their heads were particularly large. Their skulls were dense and outweighed many other human heads at a single time. Upheld on these stout bodies and broad neckless shoulders, the dwarves housed an immense and dense brain inside of their skulls that possessed great intrinsic knowledge. What they lacked in physical prowess and size, along with magical development, they made up for in great waves with basic intelligence. My apologies. Something appeared in the corner of my room there. Distracted me for a moment. Where were we? The dwarves, right. High intelligence from an instinctual perspective, a massive capacity to learn more, though the lack of physical capabilities needed in order to fight humanity on a basic front. Instead, the dwarves were given craftiness, wittiness, and the tact needed to form trading partnerships with humanity in order to satisfy a sort of vanity that they had gained, providing hills upon hills of gifts made from the natural resources of the western region. Xavier Wilhelm and his men looked upon these riches with astonishment, but they had no intention to forego their nomadic lifestyles for the comforts of this wealth, and instead saw this as an opportunity in order to garner more. The dwarves were not made to question what humanity wanted, and simply provided them with the wealth that any of them could desire. So, in doing this, humanity, or specifically Xavier, actually mimicked one of the Echidnic kings who had detested humanity. By using a bit of trickery and careful planning, he was able to convince the dwarves in order to form artifacts that could be linked together to produce weapons. What was thought to be projects of vanity were instead parts. Parts for great things they would immediately turn on the dwarves. And for the dwarves that survived that ordeal, they would watch as Xavier and his generals continued through the western region, purging the living jungle, and eventually reaching one of the last bastions of Echidnic kind. There, the Echidna that had birthed the dwarves would be slain, and that did more than send the dwarves into a bloodlust, sent them down the warpath. While Xavier carried himself with pride and urged his men closer to the heart of the living jungle, the dwarves would move to the draconic mountains of the eastern region. There, they would put their massive brains to use in their full capacity, pushing their technological developments from the Iron Age all the way into the fantastical advancements in both industry and steam power needed for war. Building great machines to extract hundreds of thousands of tons of metal for the dwarves to use, they not only forged weapons and armaments to fully equip themselves for battle, but they additionally used their advancements in technology, automation, and golemancy to build extensions of their bodies. Some would chop off limbs to create prosthetics better than their flesh, while most would invent mechanical exosuits powered by the essences of Urtha. And once they were fully armed for war, they began to attack humanity as a total. This was known as the Dwarven-Human War. The dwarves used their advancements in tech to begin attacking humans without a single ounce of remorse. Not only were entire towns burnt to the ground, but a countless number of human lives were obliterated by hellfire and machinery. The majority of recorded human history was wiped out during this time period, as the entire population left behind in Xavier Wilhelm's wake, and the Eastern Empire's expansion was devastated. The dwarves had no intention of stopping at this point, and after they were finished with humanity, they wanted to slaughter the elves for abandoning the Echidnas. But among them rose an abnormally large, abnormally dominant, and abnormally intelligent dwarf. Not only was he a paragon amongst his kin, his intellect was unmatched, and his diplomatic tact was unparalleled. The council of dwarves that commanded their current population was approached by him, who questioned their purpose. Even if this was all justified vengeance placed towards humanity, was this what their mothers wanted? Was it their place to deviate so far from her wishes and destroy their cousins? Even with the wickedness of man, they are still family, and dwarves are not savages made for murder. They are a breed of the mind, and they should use their intellect to properly curate humanity, instead of simply removing them from existence as they had once done to the Echidnas. The council was convinced by this dwarf, and eventually brought him into the fold as the Mountain King, following his order and strong-arming both the Eastern Empire and Xavier Wilhelm into contractual agreements. The dwarves would provide abundant resources from their industries and cease their attacks on humanity. But both factions would have to agree to extremely strict regulations that would stunt their ability to develop technology by a massive margin, and prevent them from creating conventional equipment that relies on easily produced materials such as gunpowder. Effectively, the dwarves now provided cheap and high-quality resources to humanity in return for their compliance, and not inventing firearms and artillery. Both the Knights of Wilhelm and the Eastern Empire were discontent with this idea, but had little other option than to agree to the terms and continue as they were. Importantly, the dwarves did not disallow either from expanding into unclaimed territories, even if the dwarves could mark ground as sacred or settle where they wanted to on human soil. It gave a valuable period of time to Xavier Wilhelm to finish pushing away the living jungle and sacking what he could of the western region before settling down. However, his attempts to push into the living jungle were becoming progressively slower. He was running out of men and resources to keep up this effort after the Dwarven-Human War, and the living jungle was only becoming more powerful the closer he got to the heart. Eventually, it had gotten to the point that even so much as stepping into the forest would cause a swarm of conjured monsters to close in on the location of the intruder, and Flora was fighting back too, growing rapidly into the territories that Xavier Wilhelm had just conquered. He needed to act fast if he were to keep the ground that he had claimed, both from the living jungle and the dwarves. Using the massive amount of wood and stone claimed from the western region, he would construct an enormous wall that bordered the living jungle from coast to coast in the western region, establishing at least 2 castles within the location built directly into the wall. It would function as a physical blockade against the living jungle's advances that could house countless men and resources. 3 provinces would form centered around the wall that bordered the living jungle, and additionally, 6 more provinces would be settled in parts of the region higher up, with the 13th province being where Xavier Wilhelm himself decided to settle. All of his generals and himself were now settled into noble houses that ruled over different fractions of land that were deemed provinces. The generals themselves were dubbed grandmasters, which all served to uphold the power of the Wilhelm family. The kingdom as a whole was given the name Lordsroot, and my apologies, that little thing in the corner is getting active again. Right, Wilhelm's family, the kings and queens of the region. Now, all the provinces together were dubbed Lordsroot, and many generations would come and go afterwards. Some grandmasters would have their families assassinated, and others would simply pass due to time or disease, famine. Second-in-commands would take the role after them if there was none of their blood to fulfill the part, and if there was no second-in-command or their blood connected, then the other Grandmasters would convene and vote on a new individual worthy of the position. That new Grandmaster would additionally bring in a second-in-command worthy of the spot as well. Now, the royal family of the Wilhelms never seemed to change, as all 12 other provinces worked diligently to keep the noble house alive. They were really only left with one necessary action, and that was to help the royal family stick around, create new symbols and members of the noble house, make sure that the throne always has a monarch upon it, to function as a symbol of unification for the rest of the kingdom. That was their purpose. That was what they did, and are still doing in the current date. Now, going back a little bit, during the defecting of Wilhelm's knights, the Elven War, the Dwarven-Human War, and the formation of Lordsroot, the Eastern Empire had been bubbling over in its spot. The Empire's capital was stagnant and in place, but the noble house was ever expanding, and so too was the population. With fresh lands opened up to them by the Knights of Wilhelm, it gave them plenty of land to expand out towards. But the region was so large that a single emperor would not be able to rule over everything all at once. So, the 3 sons of the emperor would be given a third of the empire to rule over, and during his passing they would have to find ways to cooperate with one another. This did not end well at all, as they all wanted to sit upon the sole throne he left behind. And eventually, the Eastern Empire would dissolve into 3 lesser empires that begrudgingly cooperated with one another for the interests of themselves. Now, with the empire that was made after this, it was effectively 3 of them of their own accord, and the one that formed at the core, or I should say, out of the corpse of the prior empire, was dubbed the Bonsuri Empire, and was ruled over by the youngest son of the original emperor, Waltung. Waltung would coordinate his empire down along the far eastern border of the region, which was purely a coastal area with the Sea of Tears, going far along that territory until eventually halted by a portion of the living jungle that continued to line the southern border. The Bonsuri Empire eventually crawled to the bottom of the Great River, effectively forming a sort of L shape in the land that they had claimed. Waltung's descendants would eventually establish provinces within the empire that would be delegated down to lords and ladies beneath them. As of the current date, the empire is ruled by the Emperor Raw, who has retained the homelands as the capital of the Bunsuri Empire. Due to this location holding significant importance to all three of the Eastern Empires, it functions as a religious center for the region, which focuses on the physical world itself rather than afterlives and realms behind them. This view on the physical world being the most important experience causes them to value undeath and necromancy to a high degree, as to return soldiers who have died in battle, or to give an innocent person a second chance of life. This value in undeath has made the Bunsuri Empire a naval dreadnought in the eastern region, being directly on the border with the Sea of Tears, and having training grounds that run along an unprotected portion of the living jungle. Soldiers made by them are often killed early on, and resurrected, trained and revived over and over until they are perfected for battle. Some even welcome demonoids in their bodies in order to empower them, making their military a heretical hammer against anyone who contests them. The second empire to form was created by the oldest son of the first emperor, Wolzio. Wolzio was an exceptional businessman and had little value in the religious, leaving the homelands to his youngest brother. He would head directly to a location of positional importance after he had been dubbed a third of the emperor. This location of importance was known as the Elemental Swamps. What had once been a portion of the living jungle enchanted by an unnaturally potent well of essence, now it served as an immense resource for the magical aspects of Urtha. Additionally, the elemental swamps were positioned in a location that made it almost impossible to siege from any direction. The north and the west were layered with draconic mountains, a massive range of valleys and rolling points in the geography that made it very difficult to traverse upon. And then, to the south and east, is a massive desert scorching and hot with little life. What little life exists there being most alien and uncanny. Only when the Dwarven-Human War began was Wolzio's empire tested, which proved to be one of the few areas that the dwarves couldn't properly attack. Not only were the elemental swamps protected by spirits and yokai, but the valleys were difficult to traverse, with their machines and caves not really being capable of leading directly into the province, and their attempts to march through the desert area of this empire being very unsuccessful. Their great machines would overheat or clog up with sand, resulting in them collapsing not long after their march. Thus, Wolzio's dynasty was left mostly unharmed by the dwarves, which encouraged the nobles there to request of their emperor an isolationist reform. Not wanting to disappoint his people, he closed off borders and minimized business with the outside empires. And eventually his bloodline would come to pass. The descendants and successors that followed him preserved their way of internal business and eventually granted their rule as the Kung dynasty. Much knowledge of the Kung dynasty is unknown, but it's likely that they continue to preserve fragments of human history tens of thousands of years old. The last empire, made from the collapse of the original, was fastened by the middle son, Wu Ling. Wu Ling was perhaps an even better businessman than his brother Wolzio, but he was far more devious than either of his siblings. He had no sense of honor, nor did he have an affiliation with the rest of his family, and valued only the monetary success of his empire above all else, thus isolating himself from his siblings and going as far west as he could. His empire would be settled along the eastern coast of the Great River, and would rise up to the central mountain of the Ire where the elves settled. Using this great wealth and adequate charisma, he would form trade relations both with the Knights of Wilhelm and with the High Elves, and provided as many resources as he could to them. Importantly, he functioned as a middleman between factions and would collect resources from unassociated peoples to distribute them through trade to provinces that had never even heard of before. This sort of business would thrive for a time, but the Dwarven-Human War would bring his rule to an abrupt end, as the empire he formed was almost completely destroyed by the dwarves attempting to purge humanity. In the wake of the dwarves and their eventual peace agreements, a family that went by the name of Fury Dawn would rise from the ashes and take claim of the empire. Forming healthy relations with the dwarves to help pick up the pieces of their population, Fury Dawn continued to hold the ideals of shrewd business as Wu Ling had done, but were now far more covert than he. They focused on ruling the population not with a single emperor, but collections of families that would coordinate with one another and occasionally perform assassinations if things went wrong between them. Noble houses were built based upon the resources one could claim and the monetary wealth you could accrue, which allowed fortunate and impoverished individuals to spontaneously climb the ladder to nobility if they could invest wisely. This habit continues into the modern day as the noble houses of this empire have graced their collective with the name Buiwangug, as to unify themselves and the empire under a single title. This name has likely sprouted up due to many different names being bound and cut together, and it's likely to change in the future as new families rise and fall. But with both the empires of the Eastern region and the Kingdom of Lords Root established, the only other fraction of humanity's first empire left to describe are the nomads of Narlan Dun, who passed the valleys of the Draconic Mountains between the northern and the eastern region. Unlike what humanity had to face within these zones, the nomads of Narlan Dun were particularly fortunate, as there was no living jungle to face here. Instead, they were faced with the hostilities that weather had opted to grace them with, including colder and colder climates that blistered them with broad twisters that rolled through the grasslands of the region. Most of the nomads of Narlan Dun would keep along the far eastern and northern region, which was another coastal area which helped to establish different fishing territories and give them quite a bit of game, as there was little that lived along the coast, as the Sea of Tears was still bubbling and hostile. But another group of the travelers would move their way into the heart of the northern region to take advantage of the forests and the rolling grasslands there. But instead of finding what they had hoped to garner, abundant resources and various other boons, instead they would encounter a population of echidnas that resided here. They had escaped the living jungle and had moved into the region in order to isolate themselves from humanity. They were left traumatized by the death of their sisters, and with the fall of their civilization, they had to feel the bitter bite that the nomads of Narlan Dun had to feel from this harsh weather. Their limited emotional range ensured that they were left quaking in the wake of humanity, and with the threat of humans presenting themselves again, they needed to do something to defend themselves. And they are creators, they are mothers, and their first instinct was to create children, monsters, creatures that were capable of feeling the range of emotions that they couldn't: hostility, aggression. More importantly, maximizing the retaliation of such things. The monsters they produced were incredibly ferocious and built with malice in mind. They were massive titans that would roam the grasslands, feeding off of one another and the wildlife that continued to thrive there. And importantly, the nomads of Narlan Dun that crossed their paths, they would battle with to a ferocious extent. Much land was destroyed in the wake of the nomads versus these recreated titans, and With the death of every large monster, the carcass would be brought back to the camps of the nomads, deconstructed for their magical meats, their pelts and bones turned into better equipment to adorn themselves. The nomads grew stronger with every monster slayed, and the echidnas of the northern region were quickly being pushed back. Now, with the echidnas growing weaker and weaker, the last of their population being felled by humanity, they had to make a couple of final gambits, and that came in the form of two races native to the northern region. The first of these are the centaurs. The centaurs are much like humans in the sense that they have a portion of their body being upright bipeds. However, they are layered with great musculature, a thin layer of fur that ensures that the warmth of their bodies is retained, and the lower halves of mighty, powerful boned equines. The centaurs themselves were given the task of functioning as guardsmen for the last echidnas of the northern region, and with great combat prowess, they were gifted tribal weapons, which were used to great effectiveness against the nomads that encroached upon them. In fact, the centaurs themselves were never beaten by humanity. Sure, they may have lost the echidnas to them, but in a fight with a human and a centaur, the centaur was bound to win. There was only so much a centaur could handle, though, so many people that it could fight at once, and thus centaurs were distracted for a time, and the echidnas that had created them were felled, leaving them alone in the grasslands with only inches of their creators left behind. And, well, with that purposelessness now presented to them, they needed to find a way to pick up the pieces. With the falling of the echidnas that created them, they needed to recreate a purpose in life. So they collected their armaments, they kept their ability to fight in mind, and collected the last pieces of culture that belonged to the echidnas, accruing them for themselves, and using their combat prowess and great speeds, they would protect these fragments of echidnic culture and build upon them. Ideals of creativity and artistry fueled the combative minds of the centaurs, and eventually they grew a culture within the center of the northern region. In a province known as Kantar, they established a warrior culture that used war as an art form. They didn't focus on winning a battle or even claiming territory. What mattered to them was fighting as flamboyantly and as fantastically as possible, for it was a way of communication, and it was a way of empowerment. But more importantly, it was a way to retain the thoughts and feelings of the culture that had been lost to them. Now, the other race that the echidnas had made during this time period were the lycanthropes. The lycanthropes themselves did not start with humanity or even their own creature, but rather started with an echidna, the last one left in the northern region. And with her life inching closer and humanity on her tail, she needed to find a way to deter them, to preserve herself, or at least a piece of herself. And thus, she implanted a strange disease within her blood. She awaited humanity with open arms, and as they struck her down, she bit back. It was perhaps the only time an echidna had directly fought during this great purge of their kind. But she did so with no intention to kill. Rather, she only wanted the blood in her mouth to beat the blood of the hunter that had struck her. And as the nomads returned to their camp to celebrate their victory, the hunter that had been bitten was felled with a couple of immensely painful symptoms: nausea, headaches, exhaustion, sweats, the vomiting of blood, and eventually a transformation. One that left him a lycanthropic beast, filled with bloodlust and a desire to kill. He rampaged through the camp, and for those allies that he had which survived, they too became infected with lycanthropy. All of them that had a similar fate, going into a great bloodlust as they took on the form of some mammalian monster. But after 24 hours of this rampage, they found themselves calm and in control of their transformative abilities. The piece of the echidna had been retained through them, and now they were seen as diseased and were outcasts, just as the echidnas had been now that humanity had turned on them. Of the lycanthropes, two specific groups sprouted from them: Lysander and Mulvendrung. Lysander were the greatest faction of nomads that were infected with lycanthropy, and they functioned as a tether to humanity. They didn't isolate themselves and constantly attempted to communicate with the different nomadic humans of the northern region, some succeeding and others failing. Within them, some would embrace beasthood and would fulfill the roles of animal companions, either as mounts or otherwise, but others would retain their humanity and function as the voices of Lysander, speaking and performing blacksmithing, carpentry, and diplomacy, the things that a human is capable of. Ultimately, they ended up settling to a far north, western corner of the region, and in doing so now have at least one homeland to settle in, even if their population is quite content roaming from coast to coast. Now, Mulvendrung is a simple strain of lycanthropy, and a group that seems to harbor this strain within their blood. Those of Mulvendrung are werewalruses, big, bulky, blubbery things with great tusks and great physical strength, but they are ultimately friendly, as their culture sees now that they are outcasts just as the echidnas were, and they constantly seek penance for the actions of humanity that had come before them. To be as penitent as they believe they need be, they have established several strongholds above the far northern coast, or, I should say, the steppes leading into a massive glacial environment known as Frozen Hell. Enormous monsters reside in this location, and the weather is immediately deadly. But to the thick fat of the werewalruses, they can survive in such a climate, and, in doing so, would continue to protect those from the monsters that roamed outwards. Ultimately, Mulvendrung individuals seek to repent for the various crimes that humanity had committed before. But with this, that has established a great few factions and races sprouted up from the actions of humanity and the rise of their empire. The First Empire had fractioned not only into the empires of the Mansuri, the Kung dynasty, and the Wongugs, but it had also fractured into the Kingdom of Lord's Root, the Nomads of Narlandun, and eventually into the lycanthropes of the northern region, Lysander and Mulvendrung. So, with that established, my companions and other members in call here are open to the floor to toss questions to help flesh out the world. Are there any that come to mind after the explanation of all that?
I suppose we could discuss the different provinces of Lord's Root, as they all are special in their own way, and they all are ruled by different races and peoples.
That is true. Each of these areas have quite a few provinces within them, though Lord's Root is the most prominent. Though, whether that should be used for another day or here is important. I think covering all of them would be fit for another day, but to give a few examples, what three would you think would be the most important to describe? You are familiar with them, so...
Morzadam, Silvaterra, and the Saffron Capital.
Morzadam is the magical capital of Lord's Root and functions as a domain for the arcane. There's very many colleges there that are used to teach mages very powerful and potent abilities, along with helping to encourage alchemy and the study of the essences. It is utilized mostly as a source of battle mages and clerics, as there is another province who specializes in alchemists and witches and whatnot. The province of Silvaterra is a sort of guerrilla faction, as their province is the most engulfed by the extensions of the living jungle that continues to bite and grow through the wall that had been established by Lord's Root. Silvaterra itself trains infantry and units that are specialized towards the rough terrain of the western region. But they are also the pirate capital of Lord's Root, as they settle on the coast of the Great River and have very many dock towns that are just as rough and tough as the inland villages. The final province to mention, I should say, is that of Melnontanim, often referred to as the Saffron Capital. Melnontanim is a province that harbors very many of the knights and was a location in which animal husbandry and agriculture were the biggest keys for it. They grew many resources, many plants, many foods, and much livestock that were eventually processed and sent out to the other provinces as rations or as food sources. But knights that seeked to utilize mounted combat were also trained in this particular province, as the knights of old, the cavalrymen, were ones to retire here and join the general that had formed this province in particular. Because of the various monsters and wildlife of Urtha itself, being a cavalryman is quite an interesting job. You can have a mount that flies, a mount that crawls, a mount that swims, and a mount that vomits acid. You have quite a few options if you have a way with beasts, and most people who train within Melnontanim tend to have that. Now, is there another question to answer?
With these different species, I guess I can't really say humanoids, but definitely species of active creatures. Most of these would be considered sapient, sentient races who would function the way we think humanity functions, yeah?
Dwarves, elves, lycanthropes, and many others to come, including humanity, are classed as the primed races. It's a way to refer to those that are not only sapient, but have a history that can be communicated, recorded, and settlements and civilizations that can climb high enough as to not diffuse or fall. So, the likes of the elves and dwarves are the primed races, and so too are the lycanthropes and humans. There are many more that come after it, including subspecies and other things like orcs, but for the time being, this is what they're referred to. Primed races. They tend to function like humanity, whether that be as humanity in an industrial setting or a medieval setting, or in some fantastical, magical sense of the word. They function like humans would. They function as sapiens, and thus are kind of umbrella kept under the term primed race.
So, these different primed races existing, that no doubt has its benefits, but unfortunately, probably down the road has its downfalls too, doesn't it? Tribalism, differences.
Indeed. Places like Melnontanim welcome all sorts of clades of people, and Lord's Root has been known to keep its arms open to those approaching. But there are places within Lord's Root, provinces owned by grandmasters who are human centrists, as the ideals of old humans, anti-echidnic individuals, continue to thrive. The eastern region and its empire, the Kung Dynasty, are isolationists and don't welcome outsiders as many others might, and so on and so forth. Having races to divide the sapient species of the world, that causes a sort of division. And while this division provides diversity, it also causes quite a bit of conflict for those who are unwelcoming to strangers. Now, are there any other questions in regards to this?
Are there any other minor races, the nomads or smaller groups, that still preserve the traditions and the teachings of the Echidnic peoples?
Well, Mor's Autumn itself is an example of doing so as a consequence of them focusing in deeply on the arcane studies. The Learned Man of long ago is a prime example of someone who preserved the teachings of the Echidnas, and since he was the magical mastermind that humanity idolized, the members of Mor's Autumn who continue to study magic, well, they idolize him just as greatly, and preserve his teachings, which fall in line quite a bit with the teachings of the Echidnas. But if you speak of races and other things like that, there are a couple. For one, the Wood Elves, the Wood Elves continue to bring their culture forth. There is a group of, I suppose, tribal individuals who are an offshoot of humanity known as the Shawl, who have done something similar to the werewalruses of Malvendrum, and have attempted to be penitent for the actions they committed towards the Echidnas, and in doing so, weaken themselves physically in order to return to a more primal state of life. And there are a couple of others, such as the Dragonkin Worms and their fully blooded draconic brethren. But beyond them, I suppose another candidate is the Cyclopses. Cyclopses in Urtha are quite strange, and they were a descendant or a re-embodiment of the first Titans made by the Echidnas. Those that wanted sapience in order to enjoy the fruits of their creation were turned into Cyclopses. The Cyclopses themselves are not exactly the ones that we think of when we think one-eyed creature. They themselves lack a mouth or ears or nose, and instead are a simple, large ocular organ inside of a skull with a brain contained within. They have a set of eyelids in order to blink and such, and they utilize telepathy in order to communicate. Their hands and their feet are much like roots in order to suck up nutrients from the ground, and their skin sucks in the light of the illuminator, effectively making them a plant, even though they have the blood of an animal, and can also think like any other primed race could. They themselves, being so close and old to the echidnas, well, they retain their teachings. But there are a couple of other candidates to consider, and for the time being I shall leave them for another time. Now, are there any other questions that could help to elaborate a little bit? If not, I believe that is a good place to halt our discussion of Urtha. We've covered the rise of humanity's empires, its division and the creation of kingdoms and other groups, and we've also established the creation of a few important players, the dwarves and the elves, along with the lycanthropes and the centaurs. But there is more to be told, and for tonight that shall be retained, saved for another evening. For now, this stream comes to a close, and hopefully I gather more questions and get an opportunity to tell more about this particular setting. My apologies if my readings or my talking is a little bit more fractured or disjointed. I'm still getting used to being a streamer in general. I hope it becomes easier over the course of time, and I hope I can make this all entertaining to hear. Hold attention, and maybe just fill the quiet for anyone looking to simply listen in. For now, I hope you all have a wonderful evening.